In 1978, the Player's Handbook came out. We said, cool, Jack Vance's magic system from the dying Earth.
That gentleman is the great Ed Greenwood, designer of the Forgotten Realms campaign setting. And what he's talking about in that clip is the classical magic system of D&D, also known as the Jack Vance magic system, and the main reason we have spell slots in D&D. I'll get into much more of this very soon. Hi, I'm Joe, and you're watching The Philosophy of Game Mastering. Today we're talking about arcane magic in Dungeons & Dragons. We'll talk about the classical magical system in Dungeons & Dragons, also known as the Vancian system. We'll also talk about spell slots and where they come from. And then we'll talk about alternate magic systems and how to decide which one is right for you and your game. So let's kick things off and dive right into the magic. Arcane magic, to be specific. As you may already know, magic and spellcasting are ubiquitous in fantasy role-playing games. And the precursor of fantasy RPGs is, of course, Dungeons & Dragons.
What kind of club is this?
Well, we play Dungeons & Dragons. It's a role-playing game.
Dungeons & Dragons?
D&D has two main types of magic, divine and arcane. And although this video will only cover arcane spells, typically employed by wizards, I do want to touch briefly on magical sources. Unlike divine magic, which originates from the deities of your world's pantheon, the source of arcane magic is much more mysterious. In fact, this is what makes arcane magic so much fun, is its mystery. As the game master, you could choose almost any source for arcane magic that you want, based on your world's theme or genre. But in many cases, it's much better and easier to keep your arcane magic, well, arcane. Because arcane means just that, secret and mysterious. With regards to arcane magic, Gary Gygax, one of the founders of D&D, wrote an article in 1976 called The Dungeons & Dragons Magic System. It appeared in the April issue, number 7 of the Strategic Review, a periodical that was also known as, quote, the Newsletter of Tactical Studies Rules, which would later become Dragon Magazine. Do you think it's a coincidence that the Strategic Review also abbreviates to TSR? Good question. Anyway, in Gygax's article, he mentions the 4 cardinal types of magic. He labels the first type as, quote, those systems which require long conjuration with much paraphernalia, end quote. He's speaking, of course, of rituals and material components used in Shakespeare's Macbeth and Robert E. Howard's Conan series. The second cardinal type of magic consists of, quote, the relatively short-spoken spell, as in Finnish mythology, or as found in the superb fantasy of Jack Vance, end quote. Gary goes on to talk about the third type, which is, quote, the ultra-powerful magic of Decamp and Pratt in their classic Harold Shea stories. Lastly, Gygax touches on the fourth cardinal type of magic, which can be found in J.R.R. Tolkien's works. Gygax pulls no punches here when he claims that Tolkien's magic is, quote, weak and relatively ineffectual. Ouch. Going back to Gygax's 4 cardinal types of magic, let's see why he ultimately chose the Vancian system for Dungeons & Dragons, a system that's been relatively untouched since 1974. Vancian magic and game balance. As Gygax later describes in his article on the D&D Magic System, he emphasizes the power of magic in D&D and why he needed to put some limitations on it. Magic use was thereby to be powerful enough to enable its followers to compete with any other type of player character, and yet the use of magic would not be so great as to make those using it overshadow all others. Later, he goes on to reveal the logic behind it all was drawn from a game balance as much as from anything else. Fighters have their strength, weapons, and armor to aid them in their competition. Magic users must rely upon their spells, as they have virtually no weaponry or armor to protect them. And clerics combine some of the advantages of the other 2 classes. Gygax also states that the basic assumption then was that D&D magic worked on a Vancian system, and if used correctly, would be a highly powerful and effective force. He goes on to reason that because spells required 4 different types of parts to cast, he changed one of them to coincide with the, quote, superb Vancian magic that he liked so much. The 4 parts or components that made up a spell were the verbal, the somatic, the psychic, and the material. He states that D&D spells were meant to primarily use verbal components, and some would require somatic ones. And the least part of magic would be the material aids.
Bubble, bubble, boil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble, pouring cow's blood.
But whatever became of the psychic component that Gary mentioned?
But one final threat remains.
He called it the necessary mental attitude. The psychic, per se, would play little part in the basic magic system, but a corollary, mnemonics, would.
I just had a eureka moment.
Ah, there it is. The memory part of Vancian spellcasting is actually considered a key component. Although Gygax calls out psychic as a spell requirement in D&D, he eschews it in favor of a mnemonic component. This is how he decided to balance the game in classes, by limiting the power of magic users through a time delay. Thus, the fire and forget method of spellcasting, found in Jack Vance's novels, was the best way for him to do this. Gygax's abandonment of the psychic component may also be the telling reason why he didn't like psionics in D&D. Psionics only required one component, the psychic, and there, its use would be perpetual and unlimited, thereby grossly imbalancing the game.
Power levels 8,000. How? Wait, it's over 9.
Now that we have the D&D magic system in place, it's time to look at the mechanics that made spell use possible and how this new time delay component would work. Spell slot mechanics. To better illustrate what spell slots are and how they work, it's best to use an image. Let's travel back to 1978 and open the AD&D Player's Handbook. Turning to page 26, we see the following table. The spells usable by class and level. Magic users. As you can see, spell slots show you two main things. Number one, how many spells a spellcaster can cast per day, based on their class and level. 2, how powerful each of those spells are, i.e. the spell's level. To use this matrix, you simply cross-reference the magic user's class level, shown in ascending order on the y-axis, with the level of the spell they wish to memorize, as seen on the x-axis. Note there are 3 prerequisites before a magic user can memorize and cast a spell. Number 1, they must know of the spell's existence. Number 2, they must have access to the spell's inscriptions and instructions before memorizing it, from a spell book or a scroll. Number 3, the spell level must be within the magic user's ability range, as shown in the spell slots table. This makes spellcasting similar to cooking from a recipe.
Dungeons and Dragons, Heroes Feast.
No, that's not the kind of recipe I meant, but it is something we'll see soon when I talk about Dave Arneson's contribution to the early magic system. Looking at this spell table for magic users, let's pretend you're playing a 4th level magic user in your AD&D game. At 4th level, the matrix clearly shows that you have 3 1st level spell slots and 2 2nd level spell slots. This means you can memorize and cast a maximum of 5 spells per day of the appropriate level. Actually, more if you have a high intelligence score, but that's not relevant right now for this discussion. So the spells you choose to memorize for the day are reserved and inserted into their appropriate slots. As an example, you could fill your 3 1st level spell slots with 1 magic missile, 1 shield spell, and 1 detect magic. Or you could choose to memorize magic missile 3 times if you wanted to cast it 3 different times in the same day.
I want to cast magic missile.
What happens once a spell is cast? After you cast a spell from your spell slot, it's used up and forgotten. The spell slot is essentially freed up, but can't be refilled with a new spell immediately. This is one of the limiting features of spell slots that I dislike. A little bit more on this later. Spell slot origins. So now that you know what spell slots are and how they work, let's track down where they came from. But in order to answer this question, we'll need a history lesson on medieval miniature wargames that predates Dungeons & Dragons. The game I'm talking about is Chainmail. For this lesson, we need to travel back in time another 8 years, from 1978 to 1970. Chainmail, Rules for Medieval Miniatures, was a war game written by Gary Gygax and Jeff Perrin. Chainmail was designed to simulate medieval warfare with detailed rules for large-scale battles, and it became influential in the tabletop gaming world, as later editions of the rules included a fantasy supplement. With this supplement, Chainmail 2nd edition added rules for magic, heroes, and mythical creatures, many being pulled directly from Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. In this 2nd edition of Chainmail, on page 25, you can find the fantasy supplement section. This fantasy supplement laid the groundwork for what would later become Dungeons & Dragons in 1974, making Chainmail a key predecessor in the evolution of the fantasy role-playing games industry. Although D&D wouldn't be fully formed until Dave Arneson enters the scene, you now have some of the background on how parts of D&D got its start. Let's look at the earliest form of spellcasting found in the Chainmail Fantasy Supplement by reviewing Appendix D. Notice the different types of combat units in a game of Chainmail: orcs, heroes, superheroes, and wizards. Let's zero in on the highlighted type, wizards. Under the wizard's description, it states, wizards can become invisible and remain so until they attack. They can see in darkness, and they can throw deadly missiles. And wizards cast terrible spells. Here's where we get to an important aspect of how spellcasting worked in Chainmail. The power of the magic user determines the number of spells he is able to manage. The rules then go on to show a table, as you can see here, with the wizard getting the maximum number of spells, 6 or 7. And also note that the word manage is open to interpretation, as nowhere else in the rules does it state what manage actually means. We can only assume from the other parts of the rules that the number of spells table means maximum spells known and not spells per day, as we saw earlier in the 1978 Player's Handbook. So a wizard in Chainmail not only had access to a number of known spells based on their magic using subtype, but they could be invisible, see through darkness, and cast either a fireball or a lightning bolt. This seems much more powerful than a first level AD&D magic user, if you ask me. Arneson's take on spellcasting and his rejected contribution to the Chainmail rules. In Chainmail, the rules made no explicit statement as to how many times a wizard could cast their known spells. However, Dave Arneson's Blackmoor rules did. His rules clarified that spells are constructed and packaged by wizards long before they are cast, and thus a wizard needed to bring the materials necessary for a spell into the dungeon in order to cast it. When a spell is cast, these materials are consumed, which creates a natural limit on the number of spells that a wizard could cast during a given adventure. That quote was from Playing at the World, written by John Peterson. And if you don't know who John Peterson is, I'll show you.
You just you could use them in different ways, and you can just see Dave Arneson in the Twin Cities looking at this stuff and throwing his hands up, right? And the ways that he hacked it, the things that he did to try to get around the obvious incompatibility of the different aspects of the system.
Peterson goes on to quote a conversation that Paul Kaiser had in 1977 with Dave Arneson. Paul Kaiser says, "I recently, at Origins 3, found out from Arneson that TSR even changed his magic system around. Arneson actually envisioned magic users carrying various accoutrements, powders, eyes of newts, toes of frogs, and things like that, with which to cast the spell. Therefore, lower level spells have less stuff. This also explains why magic users go out. It's to get these strange things. But Gary Gygax liked Jack Vance's Dying Earth, so he switched to use that." To me, Dave Arneson's magic system is similar to going camping. You see, depending on the number of days and nights you intend to camp, you must prepare and transport ingredients to cook while camping. Once cooked and consumed, these ingredients disappear, so there's a natural limit to how much you can bring with you, thus limiting how many times you can cook. And since spells in Chainmail had no requirements for material components, spellcasters had no natural limit to the number of spells they could cast in a battle. More so, as mentioned in Playing at the World, spell memorization has a certain ambiguity to it. However, since once a spell is ready to mind, it may presumably be cast as many times as the magic user likes, which is potentially problematic. Men and magic. Since there's no limit to the number of spells a wizard can cast in a game of Chainmail, many players assume the number was unlimited. It's not until D&D is released in 1974 that this is remedied. In the Spells and Levels section of the Men in Magic booklet, it shows a spell slots matrix and a clear explanation on spell use limits. A spell used once may not be reused in the same day. Now that you understand why we have spell slots and its long history, the next logical question to ask ourselves is, why hasn't anyone changed it in the last 50 years?
The following program is brought to you in living color on NBC.
Well, what if I told you someone tried? Yes, and it was over 40 years ago. Spell slots, almost replaced with spell points. While I was doing research for a separate video and topic, I came across an informative article written by J. Eric Holmes, author of the first D&D basic set, also known as the Blue Box. His article appears in Dragon Magazine number 52, which was the August 1981 issue. If you don't already know who Eric Holmes is, he's the writer of the first basic D&D box set, realized in 1977. Holmes was tasked by TSR to write a more comprehensive and coherent rule set so gamers who had never experienced D&D before could actually play it. Also known as the Blue Box, the Holmes basic set included additions and clarifications that the original 1974 books left out. In addition to the Blue Box, Holmes was a professor of neurology and a fiction and non-fiction author. Holmes was a huge fan of fantasy and science fiction novels, and also a writer of those genres. In Holmes's article, Basic D&D Points of View from the editors Old and New, Holmes is commenting on the 1981 basic set rules written by Tom Moldvay, also known as the Red Box, that came out earlier that year. The article primarily serves as a commentary and review of Moldvay's version, and in many ways, it also serves as a clever advertisement. Holmes says, "I struggled very hard to make all these things clear to the readers of the first basic rules, and yet retain the flavor and excitement of the original rules. I even used the words of the Dungeons & Dragons Collector's Edition, the original books, whenever possible. I had disagreements with Gygax over some items. I wanted to use a spell point system, for instance, but we kept the rules as close as possible to the original intent. D&D is, after all, a truly unique invention, probably as remarkable as the die, or the deck of cards, or the chessboard. The inventor's vision needs to be respected." That quote is from the Basic D&D Points of View from the editors Old and New, Dragon Magazine number 52. There you have it. Eric Holmes himself tried to change Gygax's Vancian magic system to a spell point system as far back as 1977. Yet somehow he's persuaded to stick with the traditional Vancian system that Gygax preferred.
Vecna's dead! Killed by cats! So it was thought, my friend. So it was thought. But Vecna wins!
Although there are different magic systems in official AD&D books, none of them are seen as official systems, like the Vancian system, but they are included as alternate systems instead, some as early as 1996. In the AD&D 2nd edition book, Player's Options, Spells and Magic, Richard Baker and team outline a new spell point system. The most drastic change to the AD&D game lies in the new spell point system described in Chapter 6. Try running a brief trial adventure using the rules before incorporating them into your campaign. The spell point rules provide spellcasters with a lot more flexibility than the standard magic system without increasing their raw combat or spell power. One of the first official AD&D books that outlines a non-Vancian magic system for casting spells in the game using spell points. And even though it's touted as a system that will, quote, provide spellcasters with a lot more flexibility than the standard magic system, it still warns the DM to have a trial period before fully committing. It seems that tradition dies hard at TSR, even with the Vance-loving Gygax out of the picture. Perhaps the Vancian magic system is just undead, a system that can never truly die. Why I hate spell slots. The limitations placed on wizards by the classic Vancian magic system isn't everyone's favorite, and it truly isn't mine. And here are a few reasons why. Vancian magic is outdated and restrictive. It's time for a magic system renaissance. Vancian magic may have been a good way for Gygax to balance the classes in OD&D, but it's much too restrictive in the modern era and is much too limiting for the wizard class. The fact that a wizard has to prepare and study their spells ahead of time makes it seem like they're cramming for a midterm exam that happens somewhere in a faraway dungeon. However, their innate casting sorcerer peers look like savants during these dungeon exams, flinging spells willy-nilly from thin air. Sorcerers look like tough jocks, while wizards appear as book nerds with super similar abilities. As we saw earlier in the Chainmail Fantasy supplement, sorcerers are considered less powerful than wizards. And this remains true in 1978, as seen in the Magic User XP level progression chart. A Magic User gains the Sorcerer title at level 9, but it's not until 11th level where they become a more formidable wizard. So what's going on here? Yes, early D&D didn't have a separate class for sorcerers. They were just titles of the Magic User class. And we won't see a separate sorcerer class until 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons appears in the year 2000. Why the new class? It seems as though one of the reasons why Wizards of the Coast created a separate sorcerer class was to provide a way for players to play an arcane caster with fewer restrictions. If that's the case, why not just change the wizard restrictions instead? Why did they have to create a whole new arcane class? The answer goes back to what I mentioned at the start of this video, the source of arcane magic. Where does arcane magic come from? Innate magic versus learned magic. Thematically, the sorcerer class represented innate natural magic, a magic user whose power came from their bloodline or other inherent qualities, as opposed to a wizard who studied ancient tomes and spells for years. This distinction created a different narrative and character building approach. Sorcerers were envisioned as individuals who wielded magic instinctively, often tied to a magical ancestry, such as dragon bloodlines or other supernatural origins. Wizards represented scholars who gained their magical abilities through rigorous study and disciplined preparation. This gave players an opportunity to explore new character backgrounds and concepts, such as characters who didn't rely on formal magical education, but rather had a natural affinity for magic. This seems like a well-defined way to remove the restrictions that comes from Vancian magic, but to what end? Because the question still remains, where does arcane magic come from? You may have noticed I've left one important question unanswered, and that is, where does arcane magic come from? The reason I didn't answer it is because that's for you to decide as the game master. And more importantly, knowing the answer can help you better decide which magic system is right for you and your players.
From the depths of the earth, I command you, arise!
In a future video, I'll explore some alternatives to Vancian magic, including spell points and constitution-based magic. I'll also show you how the source of arcane magic in your game world can help influence the mechanics you use in the real one. For now, if you're new to game mastering, I suggest using the classical spell slot system because it's easier to find help if you get stuck. I'm curious which system you use in your game. Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and until next time, happy gaming.